Hello and welcome to our watercolor journey. I'm going to show you how I created this painting of one of my childhood memories, and in this one I did something a little bit different. I didn't start with a sketch. I started with a background and then made the sketch. So gear up and let's see how it happened. As always, the paints, brushes and sketch are available in the description below. I used the Art Secret number 10 mop and I wet the picture plane or the paper up to the horizon line. I made sure there are no puddles or dry patches where the paint can pool. Then I used the Art Secret number 2 mop to create a variegated wash. A variegated wash is streaks, marks or patches that you make with different colors. I started with Payne's Grey Blue and then I added Payne's Grey Black and finally the Raw Sienna. I used Raw Sienna because it doesn't turn green or become green when you add it to the blue shade. I also used a paper towel just to make sure that the bottom part of the page is completely dry so that there's no seepage from the horizon line down. Then I started adding the background, illusions of trees and foliage. The first layer was Payne's Grey Blue, a fairly strong mix, which I randomly dotted down, wet on wet, just above the horizon line. I used some of the same Payne's Grey Blue mix to make a dry brush foreground with the belly and the tip of the number 2 brush. Here I was still working wet on wet, and I added a stronger mix of the Payne's Grey Black. Because the colors fade a lot when they dry, I made sure that the mix was fairly strong. Then I tilted the paper to spread the paint. When I was satisfied with the spread, I let the paint dry naturally. It's not a good idea to use a hairdryer on such a wet background, as it could spread the paint even more and it might not be in a direction you would like. However, you can let the color settle a bit and then use a cool hairdryer to speed up the process. Now here's the thing. When I started this painting, I didn't really have an idea what I wanted to do with it, so I didn't have a sketch. When it dried, I realized that I could see the picture of the wind pump on the farm in my imagination. I then had to sketch it, and I was rather afraid to sketch on top of the paint, but it worked very well, as I found it was easy enough to erase the pencil lines from the dried paint. If you sketch first and then paint, it is virtually impossible to erase the pencil lines. So I made the sketch and then I got ready to paint it. I started by painting the lines with a Babara Rigger and Payne's Grey Black. I know convention states that you should paint broken lines, but I wanted a more solid structure, so I painted the lines straight through. When I painted the center pole, I wanted to use fewer brush strokes, so I pressed a bit harder on the brush because then the hairs would spread a little bit. And then as I moved to the top where the pipe became thinner, I lifted the brush a little bit so that the hairs didn't spread so much and it made a thinner line. I used a Herend number 4 and a watered down mix of Payne's Grey Black to start painting the dam, as I wanted to paint it in layers. The dam is behind the tree, and that is why the shape looks kind of odd on the right hand side. Defining the top part of the dam, and then I added a wee bit of a darker shade on the sides, just to give the illusion of the circular shape of the dam. I painted in the top part or the inside of the dam there, but it was way too dark. So I lifted out a little bit of the paint, just enough to give the illusion of the water on the surface. I used the Herend again to make the top rail and channel of the fence a little bit wider. Dabbed out some of the excess paint with a tissue to give some texture to it. To create the proper perspective, the lines are wider in the front and narrower towards the back. The same principle applies to the poles. They are more prominent and further apart in the front, and as you move to the back, they become smaller and closer together. I used Payne's Grey Black to paint the poles, and then I added Payne's Grey Blue to the right side of each of the poles just to give a little bit of light against dark contrast. I use the Payne's Grey Blue there to enhance the shadow, texture and shape of the dam, emphasizing the top part of the dam as well as the shadow side. It was a bit dark, so I dabbed out a bit with a tissue. Then I started the tree. This was a very watery mix of Payne's Grey Blue, and I just painted the basic shape of the tree, the trunk, and some branches. When I started painting this, I found that I didn't have enough space for my hand, so that's why I moved the paper to the side and it cut off the rest of my painting. I'm sorry. I added a wee bit of the darker Payne's Grey to make sure that there's more texture in the tree, and I'm working wet on wet. Adding some branches. Because this tree is in the front and it had to stand out against the dark background that I have there, I extended the branches at the top a little bit. That moved the tree forward. Always ground your objects. A quick line underneath gives the illusion that the object is not floating in the air. It also creates texture and interest. I add a little bit of shading to create definition in the foreground while I waited for the tree to dry so I could add the next layer. Diagonal lines or downward lines give a little bit more variation in your landscape. It creates the illusion of depth and dimension so that it doesn't look like a flat 2D image that's just all in one line. I like to turn my paper around to get different perspectives and for ease of painting. It made it a lot easier to paint the blades of the wind pump. The wind pump that I remember from my childhood had a lot of blades missing, so that's why mine was also painted like that. The mix there was a little bit too watery, so I dabbed it out and tried again. I turned my paper around as I went to make it easier to paint more accurately. I let the paint dry for a bit, and then I started to add grasses in the foreground with the rigger. Painting grass is fairly simple. Use the tip of the rigger and pull the paint lightly from the bottom up. Here I saw that I forgot about the pump that goes with the wind pump, and I just painted the cement block that's usually at the bottom of the pump. I added some more grasses just to create some variety and interest, giving the painting a bit of life. I used very light, quick strokes. When you're at the bottom of the page, it's a good idea to start your grass line on the taped edge, because then you won't have the blobby bits in the foreground. Usually when you start with the grasses, there's a lot more paint on the tip of your brush, and then it creates these little blobs of paint everywhere. As you go further into the background, the grasses become a lot less visible and defined. Here I just made a few dots to create the illusion of grass growing in the distance. I apologize for my hand being in front of the camera. I painted the tree there on the left-hand side and grounding it again and adding some grass. Here I added some more prominent branches to the tree on the right, extending them to show up above the background. Added grass next to the fence. Because animals normally eat the grass through the fence, I made the grass in between a little bit shorter and those next to the poles a wee bit longer to give a wee bit more realism to the image. Adding shadows and texture. I used the side or belly and the tip of my rigger to create those shadows and very fine grasses in between the poles. I wanted to add some shadow to the blades of the pump, so I used Payne's Grey Black to do that. The paint in the tree had dried enough, so I used the belly of the rigger again to add texture to the tree. I tried to keep as much light as possible in the tree because the painting itself is fairly dark, so the tree is a little bit lighter. I only added some shading on the one side. I used a milky mix of the two Payne's Greys to paint the foliage in the trees. Using the Herend, I pressed down gently with the belly of the brush to create the illusion of all the leaves growing on the tree. I tried to preserve some light in the foliage, and I also brought the leaves down a bit so that they showed under the horizon line, Again, this brought the tree more to the front. I didn't like the way the horizon line still bled despite my attempts to keep it dry there, so I just straightened the line out with a Herend and some Payne's Grey Black. Adding some branches to the tree on the left. I used cadmium-free red deep to paint the wind blade. I wanted to use a color that would make it pop. Because it is such a grey painting, just adding that little touch of red or color to it makes it a lot more interesting. Here I gave the branches and the trees in the background a little bit more definition. You can't just leave the mistiness there. There needs to be a little bit of texture. So very lightly, with a very watery mix of both the Payne's Greys, I created the illusion of trees standing in the background. I used the Da Vinci Cosmo Top 3.0 and some Winsor & Newton permanent white gouache to add highlights to the grass and the trees. I also added a few snowy bits to the picture. I prefer the permanent white because it sits where you put it. If you use zinc white, it kind of sinks into the paint. The permanent white is a lot more potent and shows up more prominently. I added more bits of snow here and there, and especially on the top of the rail of the fence, I wanted to add a lot more of the snowy effect. This painting really developed while I was painting it. I probably broke all the rules by not having any idea of what I was going to do before I started. But I think it came out rather well, so sometimes you just have to go with your gut. Of course, no painting nowadays is done without a bit of splattering. I used a more watery mix of the gouache and I used the Da Vinci. I dabbed lightly on the brush and got the little snowflakes flying all over the page and my clothes and my hands, but it's okay, I enjoyed it. Little bits of snow everywhere. I removed the tape and I was actually quite surprised and pleased with the outcome. For once, I felt it was worth a signature. Thank you so very much for joining me on this journey through my childhood memories. I hope to see you again very soon. Happy painting!